Hey everybody, John here. Today I wanted to do a video about 5 tips that are really going to help your mixes sound a lot better. And I promise you, if you stick to these, it's going to help you out. So for this example, I put together just a couple bars, or what is it, 20 bars or something of just a little something to kind of show an example. This is by no means like a whole session that's remixed and mastered or anything like that. This is just basically for example purposes that I just laid down so I can kind of show you a little bit and so you can hear a little bit of stuff. So the first tip, actually before we get into this, let me just play this here for you, and this is kind of what we're going to be working off of. So that's basically the gist of the whole thing. I spent maybe about 20 minutes or so on this. So I have a little Maximus here. I kind of left this open, hopefully, so you can see. It's just a little kind of bringing up the levels and just so you can kind of squash it a little bit so it kind of makes a little bit more sense. But anywho, let's dive into this. So the first, probably most important thing I would suggest is to make sure that your levels are good. So if we kind of go in here, let's just turn this Maximus off right now and just have it kind of a lower level. So if you look at all these levels down here, most of the stuff is actually pretty low as far as metering goes. Like this pad's pretty far down. If we solo that, that's kind of what's happening there. The synth is here. The vocals actually pretty low as well. The loudest thing here are the drums. These are house drums. It's kind of just stock FPC, what FL has. So the most important part really for this first one is make sure your levels are good. And the reason I say that is because let's say your meters are all the way at the top here and everything's kind of just maxed out. You're slamming your master fader. If you look here, it's kind of not even really halfway. And let's see if when everything comes in. It still maybe peaks a little bit. It maybe peaks a little bit at halfway-ish, so you have a little bit of room to play with. So mainly the reason of this is because once you have your session laid out, you have all your parts, and you're going to be going into remix, and you're going to start automating stuff. You want your music to be dynamic and move, and maybe if there's like a guitar solo coming up or a synth solo, something that needs to take place at the vocal when the vocal's away, you'll have room to push that and make it take presence, and then you have room to tuck it back in and push something else back up. So it's almost like, imagine if you have a cup and half of that cup is full of water, so your cup is half full. Now let's say you want to increase a little bit more water in there with like a synth, for example. You'll have room in that cup to do so. But if your cup is basically full, you're not going to be able to have room to put anything else in. It'll just sound distorted. Or if you have a limiter on your master fader, for example, then it'll just squash it down and everything will be limited and it'll just squash the life out of it. So here I have a limiter on only for listening purposes. Generally, you probably don't want a master bus compressor, maybe something to tickle it a little bit, but boosting the levels should be done in a separate session and just by itself. So you should have your mix session and then bounce that to a 2-track and then take that into a mastering session. So essentially this tip, keep your levels consistent, consistently quiet, I would say, not too quiet so like you can barely see something, but at least have them healthy. Don't have them clipping. If something is too loud in your mix, turn it down rather than turn something else up. So basing stuff on that is going to drastically help you. Moving to number 2, this one is basically build your mix from the ground up. So that might sound kind of obvious that I say that, build your mix from the ground up. Well, where else would you build it? So generally, if you've ever been in live sound or worked with any bands before, you'll notice 9 times out of 10, hopefully 10 out of 10, that every input list will start with the kick drum and then the snare, or maybe kick the mic with the inside the kick drum, a mic outside of the kick drum, a snare top, a snare bottom, hi-hat, and so on, rack toms and all that. And mainly, you want to build your drums first. Your drums are basically like the foundation of your song. You can't build a house with just walls and no foundation. It's not really going to make sense. So essentially, you got to get your kick drum correct. If your kick drum is not correct, your whole mix will eventually fall apart. So the first thing I would recommend is let's mute all this stuff here for now. So we just have a drum loop going. And here, let me just solo this part here a little bit, or just loop this here. So here's just a kick going. And right now I have them all basically in here, which you can bring them out to different stems. A lot of the times I use addictive drums, so I have my own kind of drum set up, and then I'll click these outs and send it out to a separate fader, so I have my whole drum set basically for like a kick, a snare, and all that for each channel, so you can individually process them, which is the best way to do it. So you build your drums first, make sure they're playing well with each other. And once that's good, then next you add in a bass. So for example, we have our kick here, and then you bring in this synth bass, and that kick is supposed to be playing with that bass. So the kick is supposed to drive that bass. So you want them to kind of play with each other. That kick and that bass are basically best friends. If you get those two playing together, then eventually everything else is going to become easier. So you kind of build it from the ground up. And then after you got your bass, you kind of also look what you have in your session. So here, this is kind of a little bit misleading because it's kind of backwards. I'd probably like move this over here. And if you don't know how I move that track, you hold down Shift and you scroll your mouse wheel. So next we have this kick, or this kick and drums and snare going on with a bass, and then next you got a pad going. So you kind of want that pad to kind of supplement, kind of put a little bit of glue onto that mix. And then let's say you have there's a synth lead coming in here, and that lead's gonna kind of take place of the vocal that's not there yet. So that lead, obviously, as it says, it's a lead, so it's the forefront of what's happening at the moment. And then you'll see down here the vocal comes in, and we'll unmute that. So it sounds a little bit more glued together. If this were going to be a real song, like I said, I'd bust all the drums out and spend some time and really EQ, compress all that. I threw some EQ and compression on some of the stuff just to kind of tuck it in a little bit. But basically, that's that second rule. Build from the ground up. Start with your drums. Go with your bass, maybe some pads or guitars, whatever type of music you're mixing. And generally, make sure you have your instrumental, just the music playing well with everything, and then add the vocal on top of that, like icing on the cake. And then once you get that kind of balanced, then mastering and all that, if you do that yourself, it's going to be much, much easier. So hopefully that kind of makes sense for number 2. Number 3 is going to be using consistent effects. So sometimes in sessions, what I've seen is, let's say you have, for example, let's say this 13, 14, so on, or this all here is a drum kit. So you'll want some reverb on your snare, maybe some reverb on your toms, maybe some on your overheads. And sometimes people will go and say, okay, let's say this is my snare, for example. They'll go to your inserts and they'll put a reverb on it, dial an effect that they like, and cool. All right, that sounds fine. And then they go to their rack tom and they're like, okay, I want a little bit of reverb on that. So they'll click this again and they'll dial up the reverb, and maybe they might use the same settings that they did before, but sometimes not, and maybe they might change the decay a little bit, or the pre-delay, or really any different settings. So essentially your reverb is a simulation of a room, of an environment. So if you change these effects on a drum kit, essentially what you're doing is saying, okay, my snare is in this room, my rack tom is in the bathroom, and my overheads are somewhere in like Texas. So that doesn't really make sense. But again, it could be what you're going for, but generally that's the wrong way to do it. What you would want to do is build a reverb just for your entire drum kit, or maybe your whole session if you want to simulate one room. So by doing that, as you can see over here, I have a couple tracks basically dedicated to reverb. So I have this Valhalla Reverb, which is fantastic, by the way. If you haven't checked this out or if you don't know about it, I would highly recommend it. So this vintage verb is basically as an insert on this track. So as you can see in this vocal, I'm sending this vocal to that reverb. But if we're talking about drums, you want to be like, okay, here's my snare. We'll give that a little bit of verb. Here's a rack tom. Let's give that a little bit. So essentially, you're using the same reverb module for all your stuff. So you're simulating it in the same room. And that type of consistency does eventually add up if you add a lot of effects on stuff. So that's something to keep in mind, is to keep consistent effects. Moving on, the fourth one, and this one, and sometimes I have a little trouble myself with this one, is taking breaks. Because after a while, you're mixing, you're composing, and your ears get tired. So sometimes you might not realize that maybe the vocal's just blaringly loud, but your ears have kind of compensated for that loud volume. And you kind of don't really realize it. So you don't really change it. And then later on, you bounce your mix to a 2-track, put it on your phone, maybe go to your car and listen, and you're like, holy crap, that vocal's way too loud, and the bass is just, I don't even know, it's just wrong. So sometimes that happens because we just sit there at our computers and we just spend hours and hours and hours and just keep going at it. And you have to take breaks after a while. You have to let your ears rest. And when you take a break, I highly recommend going into a different room, because every room would sound different because it's different acoustics. There's different things in different rooms. So it lets your ears adjust to different air pressure, different sounds of the room. Maybe go outside or do something for a little while. Probably no less than 15 minutes, maybe 30 would be nice if you have the time for it. But essentially take breaks, let your ears rest, let your brain rest, and then come back to it with a fresh mind, and you'll put your headphones on or turn your speakers back on and be like, wow, that vocal was really loud. Holy crap. I didn't even notice that. And you get a better workflow. You're going to work faster by taking breaks. I know that doesn't make sense, but if you don't take breaks, you're just going to kind of work yourself into a spiral that you're just never really going to get out of. And the very last one, and I think this one is probably, if not one of the most important tips that'll really, really change your life. So at the end of the day, we're making music, right? We want it to sound good. And most people will spend a lot of money on the new plugins, the new synths, maybe some new gear, a hardware compressor, whatever. And that's all cool. That's awesome. But sometimes we forget that the most important part is our speakers and our headphones, because this is what you're going to be making your changes on. This is what you're going to be dialing your EQs in. This is what you're going to be hearing with. So that's the last step before it gets sent out to the world or to whoever it's getting sent out to. So personally, I am a big fan of Atom Audio. I have A7Xs for speakers, and they've blown me away. I've listened to a lot of different brands and a lot of different types of speakers, and these ones by far are my favorite. A good reason of that as well is I can sit here for a long time. If I forget to take a break, my ears don't get as tired with Atoms as as I would with any other type of speakers. They're tweeters. If you haven't checked them out, go look at them. Go check out their website or their YouTube. There's a lot of videos that talk about it. There's a lot of reviews that will say great things about them. It's just once you know them and you listen to them and get familiar with them, it's going to change your world. You won't necessarily have to second guess an EQ change. So speakers are very, very important. Also headphones, and recently Atom released new headphones, their first pair, called the Atom SP5s. And while yes, they are pricey, they are worth every single penny because they sound great. It's almost like three-dimensional sound over your head. That's one aspect of audio that you don't want to cheap out of. Some people will, maybe I'll just buy cheap monitors and whatever, that's fine. I only have this much money. I would recommend to not spend that money on something cheap and wait and save as much as you can to get something of quality, because they're going to last. If you're serious about your craft and mixing or making music, then you should be serious about investing into quality speakers and headphones. And while we're on this topic of headphones and speakers, there's always a controversy about mixing in headphones or mixing only on monitors. And really, it comes down to it's a situational type of thing. In a perfect world, yes, speakers would be the best scenario. But also, yes, you want to check on headphones. But the problem sometimes happen is not all of us are in a perfectly acoustically treated room that is a room within a room, and it's the walls are properly slanted. You have bass traps everywhere, diffusers. Not everybody has access to that. Some people might be mixing in a small room, some people in an apartment, some people in a basement. Who knows where you're going to mix? You might be even mixing on the road somewhere. You might be on tour and trying to put a mix together. So sometimes speakers aren't always the best case to use. It's always situational. It's my opinion that if your room isn't perfectly tuned, you don't have your diffusers, you don't have your bass traps, you don't have your speakers set in the correct spots, you might actually be better off using a quality, good pair of headphones, which again, I would recommend the Adam SP5s. They're the best sounding headphones I've ever heard. The comfort factor isn't as great as some other ones, but that's not necessarily the case. They're not made for comfort. Essentially, they're made for sounding great and making good decisions while you mix. So I spend a little extra time on this last one because I really feel this is important. So as a conclusion, first one, good levels. Make sure you're not clipping any of your faders. If you're recording, make sure you're also not clipping your gain. Bring your gain down to a healthy level, so that way when remixing comes, you're not running into problems. Number two, build from the ground up. Drums, bass, guitars, whatever you else have, and then essentially the vocals should be last. It should be the last thing you implement into your mix. Because if your instrumental's wrong and you're trying to fit a vocal into there, it's not going to work. Number three, use consistent effects. Try not to have crazy effects that don't make sense on different instrument channels. And if you can, do this method right here where you have a track with one reverb on it and you send other tracks to that. So you're not overloading your CPU. If you have a big session, it kind of helps conserve a little bit of CPU. 4, take those breaks. It's much more helpful. Sometimes you think a little clearly, or that part you're working on that you can't figure out or you don't know what to transition to. Yeah, it'll help you out. Step away, think about it, and then come back to it with a fresh mind. And what we just talked about, good monitors and good headphones. And just because I am a huge fan of Adam Audio doesn't necessarily mean you have to. Speakers and headphones are a very personal type of thing. It's something that you have to get to know. It's not necessarily, once you get to a threshold of good monitors or good headphones, they're all generally pretty good. They're just different in characteristics. So it's really what you like, what you want to hear, and what you trust and what you're familiar with. So stick with one pair if you're still looking and keep with that one. And try not to change it as much as you can. And another good aspect of the Adam SP5s is they're similar to their monitors, is that my ears don't get fatigued nearly as much as anything else like 7506s from Sony. An hour of those things on my head, I feel like I want to rip them off. I can't hear. I hear the piercing sound in my ear afterwards and just feels uncomfortable. I've never felt that with the SP5s, and I've had these on for a long time. So this basically wraps up this video. I hope you guys have learned something. I have a couple videos planned soon in the future. And if there's anything else that you guys would like to know, or you're curious of, or something's not making sense, please let me know in the comments, and I'll do my best to maybe make a video about that and hopefully clear things up. So thank you again for watching. If you haven't subscribed, that'd be awesome if you did. We'll hang around. I'll try to get more videos out. And yeah, hope you guys have a great day. See you on the next video.